Hello, you're on Purple Spot. I'm George. Welcome to another episode on this series, Infrastructure Code for Event-Driven System in AWS. And today, I'll be doing a few refactoring exercises on my Docker configurations, as well as cleaning up my application code in preparation for the next episodes of this series. I'll show you how I set up a multi-stage Docker configuration file, and how I ensure that my Docker image is not running using root account. And so if this episode and this channel lines up with your interests, hit the subscribe button and join me in this journey of learning by doing. So, let's start coding. So as usual, I need to ensure that I have the latest code pulled into my local machine, so I'll run this command. And then I'll create a separate branch for my changes today. Now I can start refactoring. So the first set of code that I'd like to clean up is my backend service. On the first episode of this series, which you can access right here, I moved the persistence of my thumbnail files from a local file system to S3 bucket. So this means I no longer need to use static directory references inside my application. So I'll go ahead and open my app main.py and then delete the unnecessary code in here. Firstly, I don't need references to the static files module in here. And then I also don't need this environment variable in here. This reference is also not necessary. Save my changes. I also need to remove the unnecessary test cases pertaining to the creation of thumbnails on the file system. So I need to update my test entities and test workers. So I'll start with test entities. I can get rid of this test entities method. And I can also get rid of this one. Save all my changes. Also, every time I go back and check my code, I get really confused about the file organization on my repository, particularly on the requirements file. And so to make it easier for me to look into related files, I'll rename my requirement files to start with the service. So I'll rename my requirements-backend, and then I'll also rename requirements-workers. Having renamed these requirements files, I also need to update my Docker configuration files accordingly. So let me start with the backend Docker file. And now the workers config file. So that's the first set of refactoring exercises that I need to do. So let me go ahead and close all of these files. I also want to update the structure of my test cases to ensure that I have separation between backend test files and worker test files. So inside the test directory, I'll create new directories in here called backend and worker. And then I'll move all the appropriate test files into their directory. So I'll move test endpoints inside backend directory, and then everything else inside the worker directory. In order to be able to reference each folder as module, I'll add an init file in each of these directories. So that's another set of refactoring that I needed to do. So let me go ahead and close all these files. The next set of changes that I'll be doing relate to how both of my services are set inside Docker Compose. So let me open this file. So if you look at both backend and worker services block in my Docker Compose file, I am overriding the command that is run by my container at startup. I will pull these commands in and set entry point steps on both backend and worker images. So I'll start with backend service. What I will do to make this flexible is to introduce a script called backend entrypoint.sh. I'll make this file executable, so let me open my terminal and then change the permission of the file. And then I'll head back to my Docker Compose file. Inside my backend block, I'll copy the whole command and then plug it inside this script. Instead of hard coding the port in there, I'm going to change that as a reference to an environment variable. And then I'll open my backend Docker configuration file to make the necessary updates. First thing I'll do in here is add an environment variable inside my Docker image and define an application port environment variable. And then I have to make sure that the backend entry point shell script gets copied into my Docker image. And then at the end of this file, I'll add an entry point step to run this script. And now I'm going to do the changes for my worker service. And then inside application directory, I'll create a new file. I'll open my terminal and change the permission of this file. and then go back to my Docker Compose file, head over to that service block, and copy that command. Back to my worker entry point sh. And then I'll open my worker Docker configuration file to do the necessary updates. I need to copy the worker.entry point shell script into this image. And then also at the end, I'll add the entry point step to run that script. So now that I've moved the command into the Docker images, I can now go ahead and clean up my Docker Compose file. So back to my Docker Compose file. I also don't need the rest of the blocks inside this configuration file, so I'll go ahead and delete those. And because I've removed the reference to static directory, I can then go ahead and delete these. So that's another set of refactoring done. So let me close all the files and move to the next one. What I need to do next is to integrate my testing as part of my Docker image creation. This is where the multi-stage configuration comes in. So I'll start my changes for the backend service. So I'll open backend.docker file. I'll create the core of my config as part of a layer, which I'll call as base. So all the way to the top, I'll name this as base. And then I'll create a new layer and call it test based off the base layer. On this test layer, I'll be moving the copying of my test files into my Docker image, but I also need to update the directory where the test files are derived from. And then I'll add a new step in here to run my PyTest. I'll also add another step to create a flag file to indicate that the test is done. And then lastly, I'll create a new layer called final based off the base layer. First step I'll do inside this layer is to copy the test complete flag from the test layer. So what this step will do is that it will force my final layer to wait until the test layer is done. And also part of this final layer is the copying of my entry point script and the actual execution of the entry point. While I am on this Docker image, one thing that I would like to point out is that when a container is started using this image, the default user used is the root account. And in order to add extra layer of protection for my containers at runtime, I'll create a different user that I'll use. So towards the end of my Docker configuration file, I'll add a step to create my application user and set this as my default user. Now onto my worker service. So let me open my Docker config file for my worker. Like what I did in my backend service, I'll set this as the base layer. So everything will be part of this base layer up until the copying of the test file. So in here, I'll define a new layer and call it test. I just noticed that on line 28, it's still making the directory that I don't actually need. So I can go ahead and get rid of that. And inside my test layer, I need to update line 33 to make sure that the test files are being copied from the right source. And then I'll add a step in here to run my PyTest. And then add another step to create that test flag file. And then lastly, I'll create my final layer. And then the first step for this layer is to copy the test flag file. I need to add the creation of the non-root user at the end of this file. So that's all the refactoring that I intended to do. All that's left for me to do is to test and make sure that all my services are still working after all this refactoring. So I'll open my terminal and then start my containers using this command. So we're getting an error here, which has to do with the reference to the file name. And I'm missing a dot in there. Clear this, and then try that again. All my containers are up. Let me do some tests. So I'll switch over to my browser and then access my backend service and then perform some posts. Scroll down. I get a response 200, copy the file, scroll down to the get method. I also got a 200. I'll copy this URL in here. And the page is loading fine, so my services are still intact. So let me go back to my VS Code and push my changes to the remote repository. So I'll cancel these. And then I'm going to commit my changes into my local repository. And then push that change to my remote. and then head back to GitHub to create a pull request and squash and merge my changes into the main repository. And then create a pull request, then scroll down, and then squash and merge. That's it for now. Stay tuned for the next episode where I set up Elastic Beanstalk infrastructure for both my backend and worker services. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Send me some likes if you find this useful, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like my content and help me spread the word about this channel. Until next time, keep learning and stay safe.